The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood brought notoriety to British art in the 19th century. Bursting into the spotlight in the mid-century, they shocked their peers with a new kind of radical art. This programme explores how they began a new chapter in the history of art, transforming landscape painting with a microscopic examination of the natural world.
I think all artists working at this time would have been aware of natural history. So it was important that their paintings did reflect something of this interest and this curiosity about the natural world and wanting to understand it.
The idea of painting the landscape as it really is, with a kind of scientific fidelity, was at the heart of this.
By 1850, the Industrial Revolution was at its height, coinciding with the revolution that was taking place in British art. The Pre-Raphaelites' founding members, John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, had created a critical storm by bringing a new realism to British art. And now, with the expanding rail network offering quick travel to the countryside, they ventured outside London and turned their attention to a landscape that had only just become accessible to them. Painting all details outside was new and predated the Impressionists by 10 years. Traditionally, landscape painting was executed in the studio from sketches, but the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was a group who embraced experimentation. Although embarking on such an excursion demanded preparation. First, they had to prepare their paints. Powdered coloured pigments were ground with a glass muller, then mixed together with an oil-based matter. The paint was then put into a pig's bladder for transportation. They would then have to find protection against any inclement weather conditions. Only then could they pack their easels and canvases and board the train. Millais and Hunt in particular were eager to paint what was real with a new microscopic precision. So in 1851, they took advantage of the South East Rail Line extension and set off for Surrey, with Millais deciding on Hog's Mill River for the setting of his picture. It was to become one of the most famous paintings in British art, and one that transformed the landscape genre. Ophelia.
It's based on Shakespeare's play Hamlet, on the scene where Queen Gertrude, describes the tragic death of Ophelia. Ophelia is Hamlet's betrothed. She's been rejected by him, and after the death of Polonius, her father, she's been driven out of her mind. And it shows her sort of pathetic and tragic death when she's singing songs, gathering flowers, slips into a brook, and is dragged by the weight of her garments underneath the waters to her murky depth. It goes against the rules of composing pictures. Usually we read images, in the West from sort of left to right, but of course the flow of the river here is from right to left. So he's actually doing something sort of quite counterintuitive in a way, and perhaps in doing so, he's inviting us to look at this image as being a very disturbing image, which indeed it is. He was the first artist to actually show Ophelia in the process of drowning. Millais was quite concerned to relay the natural elements to the story of Ophelia. So a lot of attention has been sort of spent on the natural specimens at Ewell. So the dog Rose, that obviously alludes to the rose in Gertrude's speech. You also have the long purples Shakespeare refers to, indicated here by this sort of loose stripe on the right-hand side. You have these daisies scattered in the composition. So he obviously starts off with Shakespeare's text that goes beyond that to include flowers, which really relate symbolically to the plight of Ophelia. Professor of botany thought it was better to teach botany to his students from Millet's painting of Ophelia than it was on taking them on a field trip into the country. It's so accurate and precise was his depiction of these natural phenomena. So you could actually read this in sort of as a piece of Darwinian image, really, that it's a struggle for existence. All these plants here are struggling for survival on this riverbank. Ophelia is one of these specimens, but being the weaker of the species, she is doomed to die rather than survive. So he's obviously looking at sort of human history, even though it's a pre-Darwinian image.
Once Millet had painted all landscape, he went back to London to sketch the figure of Ophelia. This in itself reversed the normal practice. His model was the 19-year-old Elizabeth Siddal, who had already posed for a number of Pre-Raphaelite pictures. Lizzie posed for Millet lying in a tin bath, heated by just a few candles. But so preoccupied was he that he didn't notice when the candles went out. Afraid to mention anything, Lizzie remained in the pose, getting numb with cold. It was the last time she sat for Millet. But despite this, the painting was exhibited to huge acclaim.
Ophelia is a really important painting for Millet because it really marks the breaking point from being a sort of enfant terrible, someone who's desecrated by the critics, the subject of opprobrium. Suddenly, people see this picture and they think, wow, this artist is doing something completely new and different. But rather than alienating his audience, he's eliciting the sympathy of the spectator. And there's a wonderful review of this painting by Tom Taylor in Punch. He said it brings tears to his eyes, that he is an artist who has actually managed to make dying beautiful.
Just as Millet was examining the landscape with the eye of a camera, William Holman Hunt was also applying his own detailed vision of the natural world in a field close by, painting The Hireling Shepherd. Hunt was keen to get a sense of the luminosity of nature as it actually looked under the vivid sun. To achieve this, he departed from the norm of painting onto a dark backing by preparing his canvas with a white ground. This had the effect of illuminating the colours far more brightly. He would then use a very fine brush, more like a watercolour brush, to paint the minute detail. Every blade of grass, each eyelash. Such precision would often mean only an inch of canvas could be completed in a day. This scrutiny and demanding work chimed with the Victorian obsession with technological progress and scientific thinking, which was eagerly promoted by the art critic and ardent geologist John Ruskin.
Ruskin said quite simply that you should go to nature in all singleness of heart, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and believing always in the truth. So the idea of painting the landscape as it really is, with a kind of scientific fidelity, was at the heart of this.
Ruskin saw how Millet's scientific fidelity had achieved a sense of majesty in its detail. So he commissioned him to paint his portrait. But this was to be no ordinary portrait. Under Ruskin's guidance, Millet was to turn his formidable technical skill in painting the detail of the Scottish landscape. Historic landscape painting, as Ruskin called it.
So off they all went. This is Ruskin, his wife, Effie, who he'd married in 1848, same time as the Brotherhood was formed, and Millet, and Millet's brother, William Henry, who was also a painter, and, of course, Ruskin's manservant, Crawley. They all went up together, and they stayed in this tiny, and I mean tiny, little sort of farmhouse, really, at the little village of Brigg-o-Turk in Glenfinlas, in the Trossachs.
At Brigg-o-Turk, Ruskin and Millet found the perfect site. At the bottom of a steep ravine, a stream ran over some ancient rocks. The view had no horizon. This in itself would be an innovation in landscape portraiture, but would give Millet the setting to which he could turn his camera's eye.
I think one of the reasons why Ruskin was attracted to this particular site was because of the rock. The rocks he was passionate about, what he called the slaty crystallines, the prime example of which was this nice rock. He loved this because of its banding, its foliation, how it was composed of different minerals. So it's quite interesting how he wants to be associated with it in this portrait, the idea that this rock has this ennobling effect. So he's presented in the portrait standing on the rock, the idea that there are parallels between the two, between his steadfast, fixed gaze and the firmness of the rock. So the idea is the rocks are to be sort of read in sort of ethical or moral terms.
And whilst Millet painted the details of the landscape, Ruskin, a very fine draftsman and watercolour artist in his own right, sketched the rock in the background of the portrait, keeping a watchful eye on what Millet was doing.
So Ruskin sort of, focuses in on a patch of rock in the distance. And it's quite interesting comparing the way the two artists approach this. Millet is obviously fascinated with the surface. He attends to the lichen on the rocks, the textural patterns. But I think Ruskin is far more interested in the structure, the sort of, the gneissic banding. And it's interesting how he picks out these quartz veins in the rock, which you don't get in Millet's composition. So he's really, as an artist, he's far more aware of how these rocks have been formed. The movement of water and how they came to being years and years ago through the sort of molten rock, cooled and hardened as part of this particular process. Ruskin was very keen on this portrait. He obviously saw it as being a collaborative process. He was instructing Millet in geology, and in turn, Millet was instructing him about painting out of doors.
The relationship between Millet and Ruskin was not the only one developing during this painting holiday. Whilst living together in the confined space of the little cottage, Millet discovered he was falling in love with Ruskin's wife, Effie. When she revealed that despite 5 years of marriage, she was still a virgin, Millet, at first shocked, began to see an opportunity for them to be together, evident in some of his sketches of the time.
So we bought this rather beautiful drawing here, which is of angels forming a Gothic arch. And of course they're Effie. We took the back off that drawing to get it conserved. And on the back, hidden since the 1850s, was that. instead of two angels, are Millet and Effie caressing. I suppose it's wishful thinking, but it's very beautiful.
Well, not so wishful. A year after the Scottish trip, Effie attained an annulment to her marriage on the grounds of non-consummation with Ruskin. And in 1855, she married Millet.
And the relationship between Ruskin and Millet, that also changed, really. Millet couldn't stand the sight of him, and he couldn't understand why Ruskin was almost supine in the face of all these accusations. The only spark that Ruskin showed was when the marriage was being annulled. He offered to prove to the court, bizarrely, his manhood. And it's very difficult to imagine how he could have done that. But he offered it. I have no idea. It would have been fascinating if the judge had said, yes, Ruskin, I think you really should.
Such public humiliation made any future working relationship between Ruskin and Millet impossible. So Ruskin, perhaps for spite, diverted his patronage to the third founder of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Ruskin was much taken with Rossetti's watercolour, The First Anniversary of the Death of Beatrice, Dante drawing The Angel, painted in 1853. Rossetti's interests were diverging from those of his fellow brothers. While they were pursuing realism, the earlier Pre-Raphaelite interest in medievalism was dominating his work. Ruskin offered Rossetti first refusal on all his works, which freed him from the need to exhibit. He also offered Rossetti's mistress, the Pre-Raphaelite model Lizzie Siddal, featured in Dante drawing an Angel, an annual income in support of her own ambitions to become an artist.
Elizabeth Siddal was just over a year younger than Rossetti. So she had been working, I think, in the fashion trades for quite a few years before she became the PRB's sort of favourite model. And she posed for a whole sequence of paintings by other members of the group. And then she went to pose for Rossetti, and at that moment her own dreams began to be realised, because she turned out she had artistic ambitions of her own. And at this moment, Rossetti transformed Lizzie from an ordinary model into his sweetheart and his student. He believed that Lizzie's talent was best served by allowing her to draw and paint in the naive manner without any instruction, which explains why her drawings have a very childlike character. They're very intensely emotional, but the drawing, and particularly the anatomy, is very primitive.
And whilst Rossetti and Lizzie explored the medieval fantasy world, the other members of the Pre-Raphaelites continued with their fascination of the burgeoning sciences of Victorian Britain.
I think all artists working at this time would have been aware of natural history. And with the text they would have been aware of would have been Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which was widely read, and was really a wonderful survey of geological formations and structures in the British Isles. And I think they wanted to be part of that culture. They were modern British artists after all. They were painting for a contemporary audience. So it was important that their paintings did reflect something of this interest and this sort of curiosity about the natural world and wanting to understand it.
Holman Hunt's curiosity led him to board the train down to Hastings in 1852 to paint a stretch of land that scientists were beginning to classify as a prime example of coastal erosion. He showed it in his painting Our English Coasts, or Lost Sheep, as it's also known.
painted very carefully the geological formations of this coastline, and it's not a grand, magnificent cliff like Dover Cliffs. It's actually a piece of collapsing coastline, and so the actual geology of the rock seems to express the anxiety that we see in the Lost Sheep. And this very much relates to research that's going on in this time into geology. Our English coast depicts these extraordinary cliffs at Covehouse Bay near Hastings and assembles sheep at the very brink of these cliffs as a metaphor for what is going on in Britain at this time. This is exactly the moment when Napoleon III has come to power in Paris, when there is a feeling that there might be a renewal of the hostilities of the Napoleonic Wars. And Hunt expresses this idea with the idea of the lost sheep, the sheep standing precariously at the edge of the cliff. And Hunt stresses the modernity of that scene with the tiny little steamship which travels across the horizon in the background. So that he turns the landscape, with all the extraordinary detail of the landscape, into a much richer picture that becomes a kind of condition of England picture. We see one sheep here who's caught in the brambles and who looks straight at us in a kind of appealing way, very typical technique of Hunt to get us involved in the painting. We see the shadows, a blue shadow lengthening across the green fields in the background in a slightly ominous manner. The painting is painted at the end of the day to add to the atmosphere. We can even see the light coming through the sheep's ear.
Capturing such naturalistic light effects also interested another painter associated with the Pre-Raphaelites, Ford Madox Brown, in his painting of 1852, Pretty Bar Lambs.
So he takes up some of the Pre-Raphaelite ideas about responding to nature, and he applies his own particular interest in light effects. He doesn't just paint the landscape out of doors, he actually poses his figures out of doors and paints the entire scene so that there's consistent conditions of light, bright sunlight over the figure as well as the landscape. Now, as far as I know, that's actually the first time this has been done in painting. So Ford Madox Brown's actually doing something really novel by making his model stand out in the hot sunshine. You can see her cheeks are pretty red. The painting is the first to represent figures in the open air and in the conditions of sunlight that are particular to a specific moment, that is really the middle of the day. Another way in which it's the first is actually observing all of the details, such as the colored shadow. The baby is holding a little sprig of foliage which casts a blue shadow on its white dress. Again, this is an innovation that is definitely observed from nature. Shadows are colored, they're not just dark. He's not painting according to the rules of painting. He's actually painting by fresh, new observation of what's before his eyes. That, I think, is the idea behind it being a new chapter, a new event in the history of art.
Ford Madox Brown was slightly older than the other Pre-Raphaelites. He was never a fully fledged member of the Brotherhood, but rather a close associate and supportive elder brother, whose work both inspired and drew inspiration from them. But in contrast to Millet and Hunt, Brown wasn't interested in using the steam train to travel for his landscape painting. He'd much rather stay at home.
In 1852, Ford Madox Brown moved to Hampstead, which was then just outside London. And for my money, the most extraordinary Pre-Raphaelite painting of a landscape is the work he completed out of the back window of his lodgings in Hampstead, looking over Hampstead Heath, an English autumn afternoon, begun in 1852, and he worked on it solidly for 3 years. Every single detail that was visible out of that rear window can be seen in this canvas. It completely contravenes every rule in the book. It doesn't look like any landscape painting ever made before. It's panoramic in its scope, but it has no vertical features to disturb that flat horizon. It's also microscopic in its examination of the natural world. It's like a work of science on the one hand, a kind of treatise on the life of North London in 1852, on the natural history of North London. And on the other hand, it's this incredibly evocative and poetic account of the way Madox Brown feels about this landscape as well. He manages to be both deeply objective and deeply subjective at the same time. The shape of the canvas is an unusual one. It looks like a great eye. It's an oval. And I've always imagined that as some kind of metaphor for some great optical apparatus. And it's worth thinking that these paintings come from the early years of photography. It's almost as if Madox Brown saying, the camera can represent this world, but only in sepia and white. The camera can show us details, but only the artist can actually see the detail, represent it, and interpret its meaning. And I think this is one of the great poetic paintings, as well as one of the great representations of reality in British art. So in an English autumn afternoon, Madox Brown shows us a very familiar scene, and we're invited to identify with two figures down to the bottom left, a young girl and her friend. It's 3 p.m. and he particularly wants you to notice the effect of colour in the sky, the kind of duck egg blue sky just before the sun sets over Hampstead Heath in that moment of the day. And you can see that colour reflected on the shiny top of the boy's hat. If you look more closely at what's going on in the middle ground, you can see people picking apples. You can see cockerels and hens which are being farmed on the heath. In the foreground there's a dovecot with just the activity of birds coming and going. But what you have to remember is that these things had never been painted like this before. And I think that immediacy, which of course would be an important claim made later by the French Impressionists, but that immediacy of vision, almost a kind of photographic process, is what makes this painting so absolutely striking to us even today.
And it was this immediacy of vision, seen in all the Pre-Raphaelite landscape paintings, in the colours, the truth to nature, that made their work admired at home and abroad. The Pre-Raphaelites had engaged with the scientific thinking of the age, taken advantage of the expanding railroads to visit new pastures, and in the process revolutionized landscape painting with the eye of a camera. They were all still only in their 20s, but had propelled British art in a new direction.